At this point, we have the foundation of our player game object, and we have our game manager in place. We can begin now adding the scripts and behaviors to our player, which is going to make it interact with the rest of our world. We're going to start with an input script, which is going to read our inputs from the keyboard and mouse and pass them on to other relevant scripts on the player. I'm going to go to my scripts folder, subfolder player, and I'm going to locate the player input PC script. I'm going to click and drag that script onto the boy game object. I can see that this script has a reference to 3 other scripts: the player movement script, the player attack script, and the pause menu script. We don't have any of these 3 scripts yet, but we will shortly have the player movement and player attack scripts. The pause menu script will be handled in a later chapter. The job of the player input script is to read our inputs from the keyboard and pass that to our player movement script, and to read our mouse position and to pass that to the player movement script and the player attack script. It needs the pause menu script to know whether or not the game is currently paused. If it is, then we stop reading any inputs, so we don't move around while the game is currently paused. If we look at the player input PC script, we're going to notice 2 additional things that we're going to need. We can see on lines 27 that we're using the input axis cancel, which exists and generally means the escape key. We can see on lines 54 and 55 that we're looking for the horizontal and vertical input axes, which also are default built-in axes. They represent the up and down, left and right arrow keys, as well as the W, A, S, and D keys. On line 76 and line 80, we can see a reference to the Fire 1 input axis, and it represents the left mouse button, the left control key, and touching the screen of a mobile device. Lines 71 and 88, however, are 2 new input axes, Switch Attack and Summon Ally, and they're specific to our Zombie Toys project, so we need to add those. We can add those input axes by going to Edit, Project Settings, Input. Inside the Input Manager, we can see that we currently have 18 built-in input axes. We want to add 2 more, so we're going to change the size from 18 to 20. What that does is just duplicates the last item in this array 2 times. So let's start with the bottom instance. I'm going to change this from cancel to say Summon Ally. And the key associated with the Summon Ally input axis is the 1 key. On the input directly above it, I'm going to change the name from cancel to Switch Attack. And the key associated with this input axis is the Tab key. Now that this is done, I'm going to click back on the boy. We have our input axes in place and our player input PC script, so now let's go ahead and add our player movement script. I'm going to go to the scripts folder, the player subfolder, and I'm going to locate the player movement script, and I'm going to click and drag that onto the boy game object. Now I could click and drag the player movement script component onto the player movement property of the player input PC script component, but instead I'm just going to click the cog icon in the upper right hand corner and select Reset. That's going to cause it to automatically find the player movement script and assign it to that property. If you're curious how that happens, be sure to check out the player input PC script and look at the reset method at the top. Now that we have our movement script, let's go ahead and add our player attack script. Again, I'm going to go to the player folder underneath the scripts folder, and I'm going to find player attack. I'm just going to click and drag this onto the player, and we'll see the player attack script gets added. Again, so that my player input PC script knows that it's there, I'm going to click on the cog in the upper right hand corner and say Reset. It now has references to both the player movement and the player attack scripts. We will notice that the player attack script has several properties that are not filled in, namely the various attacks and our number of attacks. We haven't created our attacks yet, and we won't create them until a later chapter, so we're going to ignore those for now. Everything will work without them, it's just important for the script to exist. The last script the player is going to need to behave appropriately is a health script. The health script is sort of the overscript of all the other scripts on the player. It's going to keep track and control the movement and attack scripts, and when the player is defeated, it's going to tell all the other scripts so they stop functioning. Furthermore, the player health script is going to be the script that's responsible for talking to the game manager and being tracked by the game manager. I'm going to locate the player health script in the player folder underneath the scripts folder, and I'm going to click and drag that onto the boy game object. Now I can see the player health script. I can see its properties, namely its max health, death clip, which we won't use because we don't have an audio source yet, our player movement and player attack script references, a reference to our animator, an audio source reference, which we haven't used yet, and some UI stuff that, again, we haven't used yet. If you're interested in testing or debugging the player, we also have an is vulnerable checkbox. If you check that, enemies can't hurt the player, and so you can test things out without fear of losing the game. Before we can test this player out and see it move around, we first need to tell the game manager it exists. Remember, the game manager is central to the core functionality of this gameplay, with many scripts asking the game manager if the player exists before they function. This is because when the game is finished, it's going to start with a player selection screen. We want to make sure that no scripts function until the player is selected. Otherwise, the player would be running around and attacking before we even knew if that was the player being chosen by the person playing Zombie Toys. So instead, everything is going to sit idle until the game manager knows the player exists. To prove that, I'm going to hit play really quick. And I'm going to notice that the player is not looking at the mouse, and none of my input keys cause the player to move around. If I go over to my game manager, I can see that there's two properties that I'm interested in, player and enemy target. Both of these are going to be the boy game object. Specifically, it's going to locate the player health script on the boy game object, and also the transform of the boy game object. These are separate because the game manager can set them to separate things depending on what's currently happening within our game. I'm going to click on the boy game object and I'm going to drag it over to the player health script. I'm also going to click on the boy game object and drag it over to the enemy target property as well. Now when I hit play, I can see that my player looks at the mouse and moves around when I hit the W, A, S, and D keys. Nothing happens when I click yet because we don't have any attacks, and our camera doesn't follow it around. We'll handle adding player attacks in a later section and setting up the camera in another video. The last thing we need to complete for this step is to turn the boy game object into a prefab. I'm going to go ahead and open up the prefabs folder and then the characters subfolder. If a character subfolder does not exist, go ahead and create one. Then, to turn the boy game object into a prefab, I'm simply going to click and drag it from the hierarchy down into my project window. I'm going to go ahead and save my scene and prepare for the next video where we're going to set up the camera.